class online so far, but never mind. Let's start with the lecture. We've already finished with the development of the prostate. This was the last thing that we did on Thursday. So the next is the development of bulbo-urethral glands. These were the glands that were lying on either side of the intermediate or the membranous urethra in the deep perineal pouch, urogenital diaphragm. Okay. This is the bulbo-urethral gland. This one. It one on either side of the urethra. This is the sponge part of the urethra, which is lying in the corpus spongiosum. Okay. So this bulbourethral gland arises as an outgrowth from the spongy part of the urethra. It grows out from the spongy urethra and grows into the surrounding mesenchyme. All this is the surrounding mesenchyme, and it is this surrounding mesenchyme that develops into smooth muscles and the connective tissue stroma. Obviously, if it's a gland, it has a connective tissue stroma. So the connective tissue stroma and the smooth muscles, they are derived from the surrounding mesenchyme. Now, I told you that in males and in females, meaning in both genders, the paramesonephric duct and the mesonephric duct both are present. This is the mesonephric duct, the pink one, and this is the paramesonephric duct. The blue one is the paramesonephric duct, and the development of the paramesonephric duct and the mesonephric duct we did last time. Now, how do the genital ducts develop in the females? We are all aware of one thing, and that is that in a female embryo, testosterone is absent. No testis, so एक तो testosterone absent होगा, दूसरा Mullerian inhibiting substance. Mullerian duct, I told you, was the paramesonephric duct. Paramesonephric duct was called Mullerian duct. So, एक तो Mullerian duct is absent, दूसरा testosterone is absent because there is no testes. So, in the absence of testosterone, I told you, acted on the mesonephric duct and stimulated the development of a mesonephric duct. Since there is no testosterone, the mesonephric duct regresses or degenerates. On the other hand, Mullerian inhibiting substance is absent as well. Mullerian inhibiting substance was the hormone that acted on the Mullerian duct, also called the paramesonephric duct, and it suppressed the development of paramesonephric duct. Males may this MIS or Mullerian inhibiting substance, also called anti-Mullerian hormone. This acted on the paramesonephric duct and inhibited the development of paramesonephric duct. Now, when this hormone is missing, when it is absent because it's a female embryo, So in a female embryo, Mullerian inhibiting substance is not present. As a result, paramesonephric duct develops. So going over it once again, testosterone is absent, so mesonephric duct does not develop. Mullerian inhibiting substance is absent. As a result, paramesonephric duct will flourish. It will develop, proliferate. Okay. Now, the other day we discussed this thing. This is the paramesonephric duct in blue. I told you it has a cranial part which runs vertically. It is running parallel to the developing mesonephros. This is the developing mesonephros. So it is lying lateral to the mesonephric duct and has a cranial part which is vertical. Then comes a middle part or an intermediate part which is horizontal. And it is this horizontal part that crosses the mesonephric duct. ठीक है जी? अच्छा. And then it has a third part, caudalmost part. This caudalmost part runs downwards and medially. It joins the paramesonephric duct of the opposite side, and the two ducts in the midline they fuse with each other. Okay. These are the two fused paramesonephric ducts. I repeat once again, the paramesonephric duct has three parts: a vertical part, a cranial vertical part, a horizontal part that crosses the mesonephric duct, and then a caudal part, which is once again a vertical part. The caudal part of two sides, the right and left side, they join each other, they fuse with each other, and they form what is called the Uterovaginal Primordium. चलो जी uterine tubes की development. Let's do the development of the uterine tubes. The uterine tubes develop from paramesonephric ducts. कैसे develop करती हैं? The paramesonephric ducts as a cranial vertical part and it an intermediate horizontal part. These two parts develop into the uterine tubes. The cranial vertical part of the paramesonephric duct and the horizontal part, the intermediate horizontal part of the paramesonephric duct. Together they develop into the uterine tube. Now, as the ovary develops and as it descends, ovary, I told you, developed at the level of on the posterior abdominal wall, lumbar vertebrae level. Okay. As it descends and comes down into the pelvis, this bend between this vertical and the horizontal parts of paramesonephric duct, this bend is straightened out when the ovaries descend from the abdominal wall and comes down into the pelvis where they are lying. ये देख लीजिए. अच्छा जी, now let's do the development of the uterus. Uterus develops at 9th week. It develops from fusion of the two paramesonephric ducts. The right and left paramesonephric duct at a caudal ends they fuse together. As they fuse together, they form a structure which is called Urethral Gland Primordium. Okay? Now it's formed by the fusion of the two paramesonephric ducts. So the walls of the two ducts, they approach each other, they are fused with each other. Then this fusion breaks down. As a result, a single canal is formed inside the uterovaginal primordium. Now, this uterovaginal primordium develops not only into the uterus, the lower part of the uterus, also into the upper one third of the vagina. I repeat once again, this uterovaginal primordium, which is formed by the fusion of two paramesonephric ducts, the caudal ends of two paramesonephric ducts form the uterovaginal primordium. This uterovaginal primordium develops into the lower part of the uterus and the upper part of the vagina. Now what happens is that as growth progresses in the intrauterine life, this uterovaginal primordium increases in size. It enlarges. Okay? So as the uterovaginal primordium, it enlarges, it absorbs these uterine tubes. Okay? So खा लेता है. So as they eat up or absorb the uterine tubes, what happens is that these uterine tubes or paramesonephric ducts, whatever you want to call them, these this part of the paramesonephric duct, this develops into the fundus of the uterus and most of the body of the uterus. So the fundus and body of the uterus is formed when the uterovaginal primordium absorbs the uterine tubes. Okay. Continuing with the development of the uterus. Now, the uterine tube is lying in the upper part of the broad ligament. Okay? We discussed the other day that the broad ligament was formed when the paramesonephric duct here. When this paramesonephric duct turns medially, it brings the peritoneum with it, and the fold of the peritoneum that this horizontal part brings with it, this fold of peritoneum develops into the broad ligament. Okay? So as a result, since it pulls the fold of broad ligament with it, over here you're going to have the broad ligament over here, attached over here. Okay? So as it pulls the peritoneum, forming the broad ligament, obviously this paramesonephric duct or the future uterine tube is going to lie in the broad ligament. This is the broad ligament. Over here should have been the, sorry, this is the uterine tube, and over here should have been the broad ligament. Achha ji. Now, what happens is that the uterine tube is formed when gainer from the paramesonephric duct. Now, is it surrounded by mesenchyme. This mesenchyme develops into the stroma of the endometrium, connective tissue, etc. It develops into the muscles of the uterus here. Okay. And the perimetrium, the connective tissue, embryonic connective tissue, which is lying within the layers of the broad ligament. Now, broad ligament की हमने बात की थी, तो और लोग the broad ligament is attached, encloses the uterine tube. It is attached to the side walls of the uterus and the vagina, and the other end is over here attached to the side wall of the pelvis. Now, in between the layers of the broad ligament, you have embryonic connective tissue or mesenchyme, whatever. This mesenchyme develops into parametrium. Parametrium is simply smooth muscles and connective tissue, etc., lying between the layers of the broad ligament. Okay. So the mesenchyme in between the layers of the broad ligament develops into parametrium. Okay. Actually, and we said that the uterine tube was lying on the upper border of the broad ligament, and the ovary was attached to the posterior surface or the posterior leaf of the broad ligament. Since the broad ligament is formed by two layers of peritoneum, an anterior layer and a posterior layer. Ovary is lying along the posterior layer of the broad ligament. Now, remember one thing. I'll go back for a minute. This is the uterus. Anterior to the uterus is the urinary bladder. Posterior to the uterus is the rectum. And we have the broad ligament attached to the lateral borders of the uterine tube and the side wall of the pelvis. As a result, the presence of this broad ligament divides the pelvic cavity into two halves. A part of the pelvic cavity lying in front of the uterus and the broad ligament, and a part of the pelvic cavity lying behind the uterus and the posterior leaf of the broad ligament. So you're going to have a part of the pelvic cavity which is lying between the anterior surface of the uterus, anterior leaf of the broad ligament, and the in front is the urinary bladder. So this part of the pelvis between the uterus and the urinary bladder is called uterovesical pouch. Uterus, vesicle is the urinary bladder. So it is uterovesical pouch. And the part of the pelvis which is lying posterior to the uterus and the posterior leaf of the broad ligament, and posteriorly we have the rectum. So between the uterus and the rectum, this part of the pelvis is the recto-uterine pouch. So the pelvis is divided into two, a uterovesical pouch and a recto-uterine pouch. This is by the presence of the broad ligament. Ashaji, before we go any further, please remember one thing. The development uterus is very important. Okay? From your examination point of view, it is very important. इसकी development पे question, you get a question very often. Vagina का development कर देते हैं. We discussed the other day that the uterovaginal primordium, this bumps into the posterior wall of the pelvic part of the urogenital sinus. Eurogenic sinus, the pelvic part, the posterior wall. This is the pelvic part, middle wala jo tha wo pelvic part, and the posterior. This is the posterior wall. The ये ग्रे जो है लाइटर ये पैरामीजोनेफ्रिक डक्ट है. This joins with the other duct from the opposite side, make up the uterovaginal primordium, and this primordium then bumps into the posterior wall of the pelvic part of the urogenital sinus. This raises a small impression or a small elevation inside the urogenital sinus. This elevation is called Mullerian sinus tubercle. Mullerian because it is produced by the Mullerian duct, which is the paramesonephric duct. So खाली sinus tubercle भी कहते हैं. Anyway, आपके किताब में दोनों नाम लिखे हुए हैं. So it is the uterovaginal primordium raises a small elevation on the posterior wall pelvic part of the urogenital sinus. This elevation is called sinus tubercle, yeah, Mullerian sinus tubercle. Now the epithelium of the urogenital sinus, endodermal layer, ठीक है. This raises two elevations, two swellings, elevations या swellings जो आप जो भी कहना चाहें, ठीक है. This is the caudal end of the uterovaginal primordium. ठीक है. This is bumping into the urogenital sinus. ये urogenital sinus के अंदर. Now, from the urogenital sinus arises two swellings, yeah, two elevations. They are called sinovaginal bulbs. ये जो sinovaginal bulbs हैं, ये they arise. ये this is the urogenital sinus. ये this is the urogenital sinus. Okay. Arising from the urogenital sinus, you have two elevations. These two elevations called sinovaginal bulb. एक ये है, एक ये है, arising from this structure which is the urogenital sinus. ये लैंगमैन की ड्राइंग है बेटा, ठीक है. These two elevations called sinovaginal bulb, they arise from the urogenital sinus and they grow towards the caudal tip of the uterovaginal primordium. The uterovaginal primordium that develops into the uterus and upper part of the vagina. Okay? So these two sinovaginal bulbs arise from the urogenital sinus and grow towards the uterovaginal primordium. Now, between 3rd and 5th month, these sinovaginal bulbs, they were two, one on either side, right and left. They fuse with each other. These two sinovaginal bulbs, they fuse with each other and they make a solid single vaginal plate. Okay? The two sinovaginal bulbs, they fuse with each other. Yeah, fuse with each other to form a single solid vaginal plate. These vaginal plates then proliferate and it lengthens inside. Achha ji, this is the solid vaginal plate that developed from the sinovaginal bulbs. Sinovaginal bulbs were two swellings arising from the urogenital sinus. Now, the central cells in this solid vaginal plate, ये central cells जो हैं, cells in the center, they break down. ठीक? So, a cavity is produced in the vaginal plate and now it develops into vagina. As the vagina lengthens, it surrounds the uterus, lower end of the uterus. So this vagina that surrounds the lower end of the uterus, this part of the vagina develops into the fornices of the vagina. आपको पता है posterior fornix, interior fornix है, posterior है, two lateral fornices है. अच्छा. So these fornices are simply wing-like expansions from the developing vagina. अब जो epithelium of the vagina है, कुछ कहते हैं it is endodermal. However, some say that the epithelium of the vagina in the upper one-third, since the upper one-third of the vagina develops from the Uterovaginal Primordium, तो जो epithelium है that is mesodermal, and the lower two-thirds of the vagina, since that develops from the vaginal plate, yeah, the Eurogenic Sinus, so epithelium of the lower two-thirds is endodermal. ठीक है, दोनों views हैं इस बारे में. Then comes the muscular coat. बिल्कुल जिस तरह muscular coat of the uterus was developed from the surrounding mesenchyme. तो ये जो इसमें vagina का भी जो muscular coat है, muscles, connective tissue element, whatever, this also develops from the surrounding mesenchyme. Now, the lumen of the vagina, this is a proper canalized vagina. The lumen of the vagina is separated from the lumen of the. Now, over here is the Eurogenic Sinus, and I hope you appreciate that this part is the phallic part of the Eurogenic Sinus. So, the lumen of the vagina is separated from the phallic part of the Eurogenic Sinus by this fold of mucous membrane. This fold of mucous membrane is formed on one side, on the vaginal side, it is made of a layer of vaginal cells. On this side, the side of the Eurogenic Sinus, it is lined by a layer of cells from the Eurogenic Sinus. So double two-layered structure here, forming a fold of mucosa. This fold of mucosa then ruptures after birth or at the time of birth, and a continuity between the vagina and the exterior is developed. Actually, so before we go on to the development of auxiliary structures, any questions? अब आवाज आ रही है? I hope. Any questions from whatever you've done so far? That is with uterine tubes, uterus and vagina. This was the development of uterus and vagina, बहुत important है. So do we have any questions? Do we move ahead? I presume there are no questions. Okay. Females may accessory genital ducts. What are the accessory genital ducts in the female? Now, this is the urinary bladder. and this is the urethra, and this is the developing uterus and the vagina. Obviously, if this is the urinary bladder, this has to be the urethra. Arising from the endoderm of the urethra, you have two buds here, two outpocketings, one on either side. So two buds arise from the endoderm of the urethra in females. These two buds grow into the surrounding mesenchyme. All this is mesenchyme on around the developing structures. So these buds grow into the developing mesenchyme, and these buds develop into urethral glands and paraurethral glands. ये देखिए paraurethral glands label किया हुआ है. This is from KLM. ठीक है? These paraurethral glands, they are the homologous of the prostate. Males में prostate होता है and females में इनको paraurethral glands कहते हैं. So they correspond to prostate in the males. Then up, this is the urogenital sinus. Down here is the urogenital sinus. So from the urogenital sinus, there is an outgrowth, one on either side. This outgrowth develops into greater vestibular glands. The greater vestibular glands open into the labia majora. Okay? So they are mucus secreting greater vestibular glands. They are lying in the superficial perineal pouch, if you remember. अच्छा जी, so हमने कहा था कि mesonephric duct and paramesonephric duct, both these ducts are present in both the genders. ठीक है, मेल्स में भी होता है, फीमेल्स में भी होता है. मेल्स में पैरामीजोनेफ्रिक डक्ट रिग्रेस कर जाता है और फीमेल्स में मीजोनेफ्रिक डक्ट रिग्रेस कर जाता है. So let's talk of the remnants or the remains of mesonephric duct in the males. Males में mesonephric duct, I told you, besides forming the structures of the urinary tract, the mesonephric duct, they develop into this epididymis, ductus deferens, the terminal and seminal vesicles, and this was the ejaculatory ducts. They all develop from mesonephric ducts in the males. Now, the part of the mesonephric duct in males, the cranial part, हमने कहा था, the cranial most part of the mesonephric duct regressed, ठीक है, degenerate कर जाता था, और इसकी जो remains थी, they developed into appendix epididymis. And I also told you that the tubules of the mesonephric duct, in the cranial part, the part in front, those tubules that were opposite the hilum of the testes, they develop into efferent tubules. However, the inferior tubules on the inferior aspect of the testes, they developed into a vestigial structure. The tubules that were on the inferior end of the developing testes, इनको हम paragenital tubules कहते थे. They develop into a vestigial structure which is called paradidymis. This vestigial structure is lying between the epididymis and the testes, the paradidymis. Females में mesonephric duct regress कर जाती है, but a few remnants may persist. From cranial to caudal, please follow this red part. Okay? कुछ तो mesonephric duct में structures वो थे that developed into the urinary tract, structures of the urinary tract. आपका ureter, pelvis, calyces, they all develop from the mesonephric duct. Besides that, इसकी otherwise there is no contribution of the mesonephric duct, so it regresses starting from the cranial most part. अच्छा, एक बात ध्यान में रख लीजिए कि ये जो remnants of the mesonephric duct and paramesonephric duct, they are present in normal people. There is nothing abnormal about that, and generally their presence is not felt in a normal person. At times what happens is any abnormality in these remnants, koi inflammation, koi infection, anything, it is only when any abnormality, etc., is uh, present, develops in these remnants, only then can we know that this structure is present in so and so person, in this patient. Otherwise, normally, कोई भी remnants जो हैं, all that I have discussed so far, appendix of epididymis, paradidymis, etc., even if they are present, their presence cannot be felt because they do not interfere in normal functioning. However, if they develop an infection or they enlarge or the cyst is formed, here their presence can be felt. So the remnants of mesonephric ducts in females, males में हमने बात कर ली, अब हम females में ducts की बात कर रहे हैं. The cranial most part of the mesonephric duct, it may persist and develop into this structure which is called appendix vasculosa. Yeah. Appendix vasculosa, ये structure है. ठीक है? इसका जो caudal part of the mesonephric duct है, ये mesonephric duct है, ठीक? इसका जो caudal part है ना, that if it persists, it may develop. अगर persist करता है तो उसको हम कहते हैं Gartner's duct. Obviously, if you can appreciate the location, it is lying in the broad ligament, in the two leaves of the broad ligament, running along the side wall of the uterus and the vagina. Gartner's duct. ठीक है? इसकी importance ये है कि at times the cyst may develop into it. उसको हम Gartner's cyst या Gartner's duct cyst कहते हैं. Otherwise, even if no cyst develops, the inky presence cannot be appreciated. ये तो हो गई duct की. अब हमने बात की थी when we were doing the development of the urinary system, I told you that mesonephric tubules भी develop हुई थी और ये mesonephric tubules they regressed. However, males में the mesonephric tubules I told you developed into efferent ductules. ये जो efferent ductules थी, they developed from the remains of mesonephric tubules. Females में ये mesonephric tubules that remain, what happens to them? Cranial part में they develop into a structure which is called epuphoron. Epuphoron, ये जो epuphoron है, it is present in the mesovarium, and mesovarium, you know, was present between the ovary and the uterine tube. I'll just show you the epuphoron, the cranial part of the tubular remnants of mesonephric tubules, and the caudal part of the mesonephric tubules that remain, they are called parufron. ये भी mesonephric tubules में पड़े होते हैं, but they are placed more medially. ठीक है, अभी दिखाई देती हूँ मैं यहाँ mesothelium. ठीक है, between the ovary and the uterine tube, ये जो part है, this is the mesothelium. This is the ecuphoron, it is more lateral, and this is parophoron, which is more medially placed towards the midline. This is the uterus, the vagina, and this is the Gartner's duct cyst. यहाँ Gartner's duct होगी ना, the remains of the mesonephric duct. This is the remains of the mesonephric tubules, ecuphoron and parophoron. ठीक है, ये आपकी ड्राइंग जो है ये Ligament की है. It's a beautiful drawing. अच्छा जी, अब आ जाते हैं पैरामीसोनेफ्रिक duct. अभी तक we were doing the mesonephric duct. Now let's go on to the पैरामीसोनेफ्रिक duct. और ये पैरामीसोनेफ्रिक duct जो है इसके रेमिनेंट्स मेल्स में पहले डिस्कस कर लेते हैं. I told you the paramesonephric duct. तो आपने red को फॉलो करना है. Blue was the mesonephric duct. Red is the paramesonephric duct. So the cranial most part of the paramesonephric duct, if it persists, it develops into appendix of testes. ये देख लीजिए, ये appendix testes. Vestigial structure है, इसका कोई function नहीं है. Now, the two paramesonephric ducts, they join together and form a uterovaginal primordium. Males में भी develop होता है, but उसका remnant रह जाता है. That develops into prostatic utricle. If you remember, you have your prostatic utricle. ये देख लीजिए, prostatic part of the urethra, or this is the prostatic crest, and over here is the prostatic utricle. ये uterovaginal primordium का remnant है. This is the homologous of the uterus in the males. And sinus tubercle. Sinus tubercle that was structured, uterovaginal primordium bumped into the urogenital sinus, pelvic part, raised an elevation, which is called Mullerian sinus tubercle. वो जो sinus tubercle है ना, that develops into the seminal colliculus. अच्छा जी, paramesonephric duct females में it develops into uterine tube and of course the uterus. Okay? Now the part of the paramesonephric duct that is not utilized in the formation of uterine tube. I'm talking of the part of the, I'm talking about the fact that the paramesonephric duct develops into uterine tube and the uterus and even the upper part of the vagina. But you have a part of the paramesonephric duct that does not develop into the uterine tube. This part is called hydatid of Morgagni. Vesicular appendix भी कहते हैं इसको. Yeah, hydatid of Morgagni भी कहते हैं. Whatever you want to remember. और ये वही जो हमने mesonephric duct के remnants किए थे. Parophoron over here would be, these are the ecuphoron. ये Gartner's duct है, Gartner's cyst. चलिए, चलो जी, अब आ जाते हैं anomalies पे. Anomalies of the uterine tube. And the problem with the anomalies of the uterine tube is कि आपकी किताब में there is no picture given regarding the anomalies of the uterine tubes. So इससे पहले कि मैं anomalies start करूं, do we have any questions regarding what we've done so far? Any questions? Anything you want me to repeat, Victor? नहीं है. Fine. अच्छा जी. अब एक बात तो ये है कि ये जो यूट्राइन ट्यूब्स के अनोमलीज है ना, this is something very rare. ठीक है. So when present, it could be either a hydrated cyst या फिर accessory openings. ये देख लीजिए. एक तो opening ये है ना, one ostium. This is the other ostium. Extra opening है. ठीक है. Then duplication. ये देख लीजिए, एक uterine tube. This is another one, duplicated. The uterine tube may be completely absent, or part of it may be absent. एक part बना ही नहीं. या ये कि it lacks muscle support in places or completely. Or failure of the tube to canalize. ये देख लीजिए, ये tube है. You have a lumen over here, you have a lumen over here. Partial or complete loss of canalization. So ये सब जो है ना, ये देख लीजिए, lumen not canalized. ठीक है. So all these are various anomalies of the uterine tube. Picture किताब में इसलिए नहीं दी हुई because this is something so rare कि you hardly ever find an anomaly. Let's start with the abnormal development of the uterus here, uterine anomalies. Now, uterine anomalies are very important. ये आपको question आता होता है. It's the different anomalies of the uterus and a whole lot, a long list of anomalies of the uterus maybe are present as given in your books. ठीक है. अच्छा जी. अब बात ये है, the uterus is formed by the fusion of caudal part of paramesonetic ducts. ठीक है. Right and left ducts, they fuse together and they form the uterus. If these ducts do not fuse, they remain separate. So two uteruses will develop, right and left. And this type of anomaly is associated either with two vagina, two uterus develop, and each uterus has its own vagina. या फिर ये हो सकता है two uterus developing because of non-fusion of caudal part of paramesonetic duct, and these two uterus they open into a common vagina, a single vagina. ये देख लीजिए. ठीक है. अच्छा जी. ये थोड़ा सा आपको मुश्किल नाम लगेगा, है बीच में से कुछ भी नहीं. यूट्रस डायडेल्फिस भी कहते हैं डबल यूट्रस को. यूट्रस डायडेल्फिस, यूट्रस बाइकॉर्नस, बाइकॉर्नस अभी समझ आ जाती है. बाइकॉर्नर यूट्रस with two horns, each with separate cervix and a double vagina. वही जो हमने अभी देखा. Two horns of uterus, is cervix, separate, and two vagina. So you have literally have two uterus which are joined together at the lower end, but only joined at only at the lower end. But you practically have two uterus. Unicornus means single vagina. Uterus bicornus, unicornus. uterus with two horns, but a single vagina. Both the horns they open in one common vagina. अच्छा जी. Separate uterus. Normally, on the outer surface, externally, the uterus is single. But on the inside, the uterus is divided into two compartments by this septum. अब हुआ ये था कि when the two paramesonephric ducts, when they came close to each other and they fused with each other, तो total breakdown of wall नहीं हुई. अब ये जो septum है, this may usually ends over here at the internal os. However, sometimes, very rarely, the septum may extend from the fundus over here down to the isthmus. यहाँ पहला जो commoner condition थी, so the septum which divides the cavity of the uterus ends at the isthmus over here. Okay? But this is something very rare because the septum is now opening, going as far as the internal os. Uterus arcuatus, indentation produce हो रही है, ये देख लीजिए. इसमें the fundus fails to develop. I told you the fundus develops when the uterovaginal primordium it absorb कर लेता है the horns of the absorb कर लेता है the mesonephric duct, the part of the mesonephric duct that was developing into the uterine tubes. Uterine tubes को absorb कर लेता है and the fundus and most of the body of the uterus is formed. Ab, if the fundus is not formed, the upper end of the uterus is indented. ये देखिए, इसको uterus arcuatus कहते हैं. This is a bicornate uterus with a rudimentary horn. इसमें क्या होता है कि two paramesonephric duct, they should have fused, they did not fuse. One horn grows normally, the other horn is not properly developed, growth retardation हो जाती है यहाँ पे. They do not. अच्छा, अब इस केस में there is one condition that in which the horn does not form properly and it does not communicate with the uterus. The two horns do not fuse with each other, do not communicate with each other. एक rudimentary horn है जो properly develop ही नहीं हुआ, एक normally developed horn है. And this is a condition in which this horn is rudimentary, not developed properly, not developed normally, but however it communicates with the uterine cavity. So, दोनों condition है. This top picture is taken from Ligament. This unicornate uterus, just one horn, a small uterus, एक side का horn, this side, the mesonephric duct on this side, या तो develop ही नहीं हुई, या फिर ये कि develop हुई थी but degenerate कर गई, whatever. जब degenerate करके वो disappear कर गई, whatever happened. Just one paramesonephric duct that develops into the uterus. As a result, one horn of the uterus with one uterine tube. In this case, the person is fertile, no doubt about that. But what happens is, since the uterus is small, the baby will not grow up to normal size. As a result, the baby is born prematurely. Okay? So, in this case, a very high incidence of delivering of premature babies is seen in these cases. ओके, विजाइना के एनॉमलीज कर लेते हैं। तो ये कि विजाइना डेवलप ही नहीं हुआ, अच्छा बात खत्म, ठीक है। 1 in 5,000 बेबीज में देयर इज एब्सेंस ऑफ विजाइना। अब एब्सेंस क्यों हुई? बिकॉज जो यूरोजेनिटल साइनस से साइनोविजाइनल बल्ब्स जो डेवलप हुए थे वो नहीं डेवलप हुए, एज अ रिजल्ट विजाइनल प्लेट नहीं बनी। अब इस केस में usually uterus is also absent because the uterovaginal primordium नहीं बना। uterovaginal primordium नहीं बना तो it is the uterovaginal primordium that induces the urogenital sinus to start the development of sinovaginal bulbs. Sinovaginal bulb से vagina बनता है. So all these anomalies go hand in hand. So other anomalies, if this is the condition, कि vagina नहीं बना, the lower part of the uterus is not formed, this may be associated with other anomalies, skeletal anomalies, urogenital tract anomalies. This may be present as well. In all these anomalies together make up what is called this difficult name, some syndrome, Meyer's Rokitansky's Foster-Hauser syndrome. Rokitansky है ये, ठीक है? Okay, vaginal atresia. There was a development of vagina, sinovaginal bulb भी बने थे, but what happened was vaginal plate भी बन गई ना, sinovaginal bulbs fuse करके vaginal plate बन गई, but there is failure of canalization of the vaginal plate. When the vaginal plate fails to canalize, the vagina does not develop. Happens 1 in 80,000 female babies. So there is absence of lower 2/3 of the vagina, upper 1/3 of the vagina, जो कि uterovaginal primordium से develop होता है, that develops, ठीक है, cervix को surround भी करता है, but this is how it's seen bulging out surrounding the cervix. A pouch, vaginal pouch कहते हैं इसको. So the vagina is simply represented by a septum, a transverse septum. Atresia of cervix. Vagina तो बना है, cervix नहीं बना, ठीक है? Partial या complete atresia of both paramesonephric ducts. In that case, there is atresia of the cervix. Double vagina, failure of fusion of sinovaginal bulbs. It may exist in the form of a complete separate vagina, या फिर common, or the two vagina that develop may be separated only by simply a membranous septum. Normally, hymen perforate after birth, but at times it fails to perforate. The condition can only be detected when puberty starts and there is no menstruation. Menstruation तो हो रही होती है, but there is no flow because the hymen is not perforated. This is just to show you the different shapes of these. When menstrual blood does not flow out because of imperforate hymen, the blood keeps on collecting in the uterus, and a condition called hematocolpos is seen. इसमें simply surgically excise the hymen and let the blood flow out.
मैम लेक्चर का टाइम खत्म हो गया, मैम वेट कर रही है.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
मैम स्क्रीन स्टॉप करते हैं।
स्टॉप कर दे बेटा।
जी मैम स्टॉप कर दें।